Nobody in the arena expected the night to turn into a psychological battlefield. It started with something simple: Caitlin Clark stepping into the building with the calm confidence of a player who knows all eyes are already on her. Cameras locked in instantly. Phones came out instantly. And then it happened. The moment that set everything in motion. Her signature shoe. The first step of a new era, the Caitlin Clark Caitlin 1, wasn't just footwear, it was a statement. A symbol. A spotlight magnet that instantly took over social media before she even finished walking through the tunnel. But what came next flipped the entire narrative. Because right across the competitive line stood Angel Reese, and suddenly, the energy shifted. What should have been Clark's moment of celebration turned into something else entirely. Cameras caught Reese reacting, responding, and positioning herself in a way fans immediately started breaking down frame by frame. Was it coincidence? Was it timing? Or was it something deeper brewing between two of the most talked-about young stars in women's basketball? Within minutes, the internet didn't care about the game anymore. It was about intention. It was about rivalry. And it was about whether one player's spotlight had just triggered a reaction that could be felt far beyond the court. Clips spread fast. Commentary accounts exploded. Fans started debating every glance, every step, every second of footage like it was evidence in a case nobody officially opened, but everyone felt invested in. And at the center of it all sat a question that refused to die down. Did Caitlin Clark's signature shoe reveal simply steal the spotlight? Or did it send Angel Reese into a competitive reaction the league didn't see coming? Because what started as a shoe debut didn't stay a shoe debut for long. It turned into something much bigger. A moment where basketball, ego, and rivalry collided in real time, and neither side walked away the same. To understand why this moment exploded the way it did, you have to step back from the noise, the edits, and the social media narratives, and look at the two careers that made this collision feel almost inevitable. On one side is Caitlin Clark, a generational scoring guard whose rise changed the attention economy of women's basketball almost overnight. From her college dominance to her transition into the WNBA, Clark has been more than just a player. She's become a broadcast engine. Every game she plays pulls national coverage, record-breaking viewership spikes, and a level of scrutiny usually reserved for franchise-defining superstars. Her game is built on range, speed of decision-making, and a deep shooting ability that stretches defenses in a way few players in the sport can replicate. But just as important as her production is what she represents: a new era of visibility. For better or worse, Clark is no longer just evaluated on points and assists. She is measured against expectation, hype, and the emotional reactions of fans who either celebrate her rise or actively root against it. That kind of spotlight creates pressure, but it also creates gravity. Everything around her becomes amplified. A normal foul becomes a viral clip. A normal reaction becomes a headline. And a normal night becomes a referendum. Across from her in this growing cultural narrative stands Angel Reese, a player whose identity has been shaped just as much by personality, confidence, and competitiveness as by basketball skill. Reese brings a different kind of presence to the court. She plays with emotion, she embraces confrontation, and she does not shy away from attention. Where Clark represents precision and perimeter dominance, Reese represents physicality, rebounding, and psychological edge. But what truly binds these two names together in modern basketball discourse is not just talent, it's history. Their rivalry didn't begin in the WNBA. It traces back to college basketball, where intense matchups, emotional reactions, and viral moments created the foundation for a storyline that media outlets and fans have never fully let go of. Even as both players moved into the professional level, that narrative followed them like a shadow. Every time they share a court, or even indirectly overlap in timing, performance, or media attention, the internet reacts as if it's a continuation of that earlier chapter. Every gesture becomes loaded. Every reaction becomes symbolic. And every moment becomes a potential next episode in a rivalry that exists as much online as it does on the hardwood. That is the environment this game was played in. Add to that the modern reality of women's basketball in 2026, a league undergoing rapid growth, increased media investment, and a fan base that now consumes highlights in real time, frames in slow motion, and narratives in full emotional detail. The WNBA is no longer just a sports league in the background of the sports world, it is now part of the main conversation. Which means every high-profile player interaction becomes content. Every tunnel walk becomes a storyline. Every sneaker reveal becomes a cultural moment. So when Clark's signature shoe entered the conversation, the Caitlin 1, a milestone product tied directly to her rise, it wasn't just a sneaker launch. It was a brand-defining event. The kind of moment that signals arrival not just as a player, but as a market force. A symbol of influence that extends beyond basketball into fashion, identity, and youth culture. In modern sports, signature shoes are never just about performance. They are about narrative ownership. They say, this player is no longer part of the system, they are shaping it. And that's exactly why the timing of everything around this game mattered so much. Because in the same environment where Clark was stepping into a new level of visibility, Reese was already navigating her own growing brand presence, her own endorsements, her own spotlight, and her own evolving identity within the league. Two young stars, both media magnets, both constantly analyzed, both operating in a space where attention itself is a competitive resource. That is what makes their interactions so combustible in the public eye. Not because of a single play, or a single reaction, or a single game, but because the narrative infrastructure around them is already built for conflict interpretation. Fans don't just watch them play basketball anymore. They watch them through layers of context, memory, and expectation. So when Clark's shoe debut happened inside that environment, it wasn't just seen as a personal milestone. It was interpreted as a moment of dominance, arrival, and spotlight control. And anything happening on the opposing side of the court at that exact time, whether coincidence or coincidence misunderstood, was immediately pulled into that same narrative orbit. This is how modern sports storytelling works now. Moments don't exist in isolation. They stack. They collide. They get rewritten in real time by audiences who are watching not just the game, but the meaning behind the game. And that is the exact pressure cooker where everything that followed began to form. Long before a single whistle, a single possession, or a single viral clip ever appeared online. The game didn't explode all at once. It built. Slowly at first, like a normal high-stakes WNBA matchup where both teams test spacing, tempo, and defensive matchups in the opening minutes. But the moment Caitlin Clark started finding rhythm, everything shifted. Her first clean looks came early. A catch-and-shoot three. Then a quick pull-up in transition. Then a read that forced Atlanta's defense to collapse just half a second too late. And that half second was all she needed. Because when Clark is on time, defenses are already late. Gainbridge Fieldhouse started reacting before the scoreboard even caught up. Every possession where she crossed half court felt like something might happen. And that kind of gravity changes how every defender moves, even when she doesn't have the ball. But Atlanta didn't break. They adjusted. Not by stopping Clark completely, but by forcing Indiana to prove they could sustain offense without everything running through her hands every trip down the floor. That's where the game's first real tension appeared. Indiana's offense looked fluid when Clark initiated. Ball movement, spacing, rhythm, everything connected. But when she was forced into off-ball sequences or temporary bench rotations, the structure didn't look the same. Possessions became more isolated. Decisions came later in the clock. And Atlanta's defense tightened the paint immediately. Then came the physical tone of the game. It wasn't one moment. It was accumulation. Drives into contact. Close contests on the perimeter. Bodies meeting early in transition before players could fully gather momentum. Referees allowed a level of physicality that kept both teams adjusting instead of settling. And that's where the first turning point began to form. Clark picked up early fouls in situations that changed her defensive approach. Not necessarily dramatic calls on their own, but impactful enough to affect how aggressively she could stay attached to ball handlers. Each whistle changed her positioning. Each whistle changed Indiana's defensive structure behind her. And once that happens, everything else becomes harder. Because Indiana's defensive identity relies heavily on communication and rotation speed, especially when their primary creator is also responsible for initiating pressure on the ball. Atlanta noticed. They started attacking downhill more consistently, forcing help rotations from Indiana's interior defenders. That opened up the exact thing Indiana had been trying to prevent: clean paint touches. Inside scoring started stacking up. Not in one run, but in repeated sequences where Atlanta simply beat rotations by a step. A drive here. A dump off there. A second chance finish when Indiana couldn't fully secure the rebound. And slowly, the scoreboard reflected what the eye test already showed. Momentum wasn't stable. It was swinging every few possessions. Then came the moment that changed the entire tone of the broadcast discussion. Clark went to the bench after another whistle sequence that added to her foul count. And immediately, Indiana's offense looked different. Not worse in effort, but different in structure. The pace slowed. The ball stuck longer on the perimeter. Entry passes into the post came later. Atlanta's defense didn't have to respect deep spacing in the same way because the most dangerous long-range threat wasn't orchestrating the possession. That's the real turning point. Not a highlight. Not a shot. But absence. Because when Clark sits, defenses don't just adjust, they compress everything. And Atlanta took advantage. They pushed transition chances after turnovers. They attacked mismatches in early offense. And they forced Indiana into scrambling rotations that arrived a half-step late repeatedly. The gap didn't become a blowout. But it became noticeable. And once a game reaches that stage, every possession starts feeling heavier. Then came the first major twist of interpretation that spread online during the game itself. Clips of physical plays began circulating in real time. Fouls, collisions, reactions, each one isolated and analyzed independently by fans without the full context of game flow, fatigue, or rotation timing. Some viewers saw aggressive defense. Others saw inconsistency in officiating. And both interpretations started building separate narratives around the same sequence of events. That's where modern basketball discourse shifts from game analysis to identity debate. Because it's no longer just, what happened? It becomes, what people think is happening repeatedly. Meanwhile, Indiana's offense continued to show a split personality. With Clark initiating, the spacing opened. Boston got cleaner post touches. Mitchell found rhythm in mid-range pull-ups. The ball moved faster and cleaner. Without her initiating, possessions leaned heavily on isolation or late-clock improvisation. That contrast became one of the central talking points even before halftime. Not because Indiana was playing poorly, but because the dependency was obvious. And Atlanta leaned into it. They didn't need to shut everything down. They just needed to force Indiana to play enough possessions without perfect structure to create scoring droughts. That's how the first half slowly tilted. Not with one defining run, but with control shifting away from Indiana in small, repeatable segments. And by the time the first half stretched toward its closing minutes, the game wasn't about individual moments anymore. It was about rhythm. Who had it? Who lost it? And who could force the other team into playing uncomfortable basketball for longer stretches? And that's where the real conflict begins to sharpen, because once rhythm becomes the story, every substitution, every foul, and every rotation becomes part of a much larger argument unfolding in real time. Not just on the court, but everywhere the game is being watched. By the time the second half began, the game no longer felt like a standard regular season matchup. It felt like a pressure test that both teams were trying to solve in real time. Indiana came out needing control, clean possessions, defensive stability, and a reset of rhythm after stretches where Atlanta had steadily chipped away at their structure. But Atlanta didn't allow the reset. They increased the pace immediately. Not recklessly, but deliberately. Early offense became their weapon. Instead of letting Indiana set its half-court defense, they pushed the ball up the floor within seconds of rebounds or turnovers. That forced Indiana's transition coverage into constant rotation mode, and rotation basketball is where mistakes multiply. And mistakes started to show. A missed assignment here. A late closeout there. A defensive rebound that turned into a second-chance opportunity because box-outs didn't fully hold. Nothing looked catastrophic individually. But together, it started building a different scoreboard reality. Then came the shift in officiating perception that would dominate post-game discussion. A series of whistles in the second half tightened Indiana's defensive flexibility. Fouls accumulated quickly across multiple players, forcing rotations earlier than planned. That meant bench units were asked to defend longer stretches against Atlanta's starting creators. And that changes everything. Because when a team's rotation is forced early, offensive rhythm and defensive communication both start to fragment. Clark's minutes became a focal point again, not because of one specific moment, but because of how Indiana's entire structure changed depending on whether she was on the floor or not. When she played, Indiana's offense had flow. The ball moved faster, spacing widened, and Boston and Mitchell found more natural scoring windows. When she sat, possession slowed. Entry passes came later. Shot selection became more difficult under pressure. And Atlanta's defense collapsed inward to take away interior action. That contrast became impossible to ignore. Midway through the third quarter, Atlanta capitalized on one of those bench stretches. They attacked switches, hunted mismatches, and forced Indiana's help defenders to commit early. Once help came, the kick-out game opened up clean perimeter looks or downhill drives. That sequence didn't show up as a single highlight. It showed up as a run. And runs are what change narratives. At the same time, Clark's defensive assignments became more complicated as foul pressure influenced how closely she could contest. That subtle adjustment, playing slightly more cautious defense, gave Atlanta just enough space to initiate actions without full resistance at the point of attack. It wasn't visible in a single clip. But over multiple possessions, it became clear. Then came the moment that started spreading across social media in real time. A sequence of contact-heavy plays around the rim and perimeter got clipped and reposted almost instantly. Fans began breaking down angles, slow-motion replays, and alternate broadcast feeds trying to interpret intent versus incidental contact. Some saw aggressive defense being rewarded. Others saw inconsistency in whistle timing. And both interpretations began feeding entirely different narratives about how the game was being controlled. But inside the arena, the effect was simpler. Indiana could not stabilize long enough to build a consistent run. Every time they cut into momentum, Atlanta responded with either a transition bucket or a physical defensive possession that forced a tough shot late in the clock. That's when the real shocking reveal of the game wasn't a highlight, it was a pattern. Atlanta's scoring wasn't coming from isolation brilliance. It was coming from structural advantage created by repeated pressure on Indiana's rotations. And Indiana's breakdowns weren't random mistakes. They were recurring under the same conditions: early foul trouble, disrupted substitution rhythm, and inconsistent half-court initiation when primary ball-handling responsibility shifted off Clark. That's the tactical truth underneath everything. Then the fourth quarter arrived, and the game fully tilted into survival mode. Indiana attempted to re-establish control through half-court sets, but Atlanta's defensive reads were already locked in. They anticipated entry passes, jumped passing lanes, and forced Indiana into secondary options earlier than they wanted. Each possession became more difficult than the last. Not because Indiana stopped trying, but because Atlanta had fully adapted. And once a defense has timing on your sets, everything slows down. Possession by possession, Atlanta built separation again. And Indiana's response became reactive instead of structured. At that point, the broadcast conversation shifted too. Not toward one play, but toward why Indiana's offensive identity looked so different depending on lineup stability and foul distribution. Because when Clark was involved early in possessions, Indiana functioned like a high-tempo, spacing-driven offense capable of generating clean looks for multiple scorers. When she wasn't initiating, everything compressed. That contrast became the most important analytical takeaway of the game. And it set up the final phase of the matchup, not as a highlight finish, but as a structural conclusion to how the game had been unfolding since the opening minutes. Because by the final stretch, it wasn't about adjusting anymore. It was about whether Indiana had enough time left to recover rhythm that had been disrupted for most of the second half. And that question had no simple answer. Only possession after possession left to play. The final buzzer didn't end the conversation. It expanded it. Because within minutes of the game finishing, the discussion wasn't focused on just the scoreline or the box score. It was about interpretation, about officiating, about rhythm shifts, about how Indiana's performance looked so different depending on lineup structure and foul distribution across the game. And that's where modern basketball discourse really begins, not at the end of the game, but immediately after it, when clips start circulating and narratives start forming in real time. On social media, the first wave of reaction centered around key sequences that had already been circulating during the game itself. Fans replayed contact-heavy possessions frame by frame, slowing down angles, zooming in on defensive positioning, and debating whether certain calls were consistent with how similar plays were officiated earlier in the season. One group of viewers focused on physicality, arguing that the game had a playoff-like intensity and that both teams were simply playing aggressive, competitive basketball within the rules as called on the floor. Another group focused on inconsistency, pointing out sequences where similar contact appeared to be treated differently depending on timing, game situation, or player involvement. And between those two perspectives, a larger conversation formed about officiating transparency and how difficult it is to maintain consistency in a fast-paced, physical league environment. But the conversation didn't stop at officiating. It quickly shifted to Indiana's structure as a team. Analysts on post-game breakdowns highlighted a clear pattern. Indiana's offensive identity changes dramatically depending on who is initiating possessions. When Caitlin Clark controlled early offense, the spacing opened, the ball moved faster, and secondary scorers like Aaliyah Boston and Kelsey Mitchell found more natural scoring opportunities. When she was off the floor or forced into secondary actions, Indiana's possessions became more isolation-heavy, slower, and more predictable for opposing defenses. That contrast became one of the most discussed tactical points after the game. Because it wasn't about effort. It was about structure. And structure is what analysts tend to focus on when trying to explain why momentum swings happen over the course of a game. Meanwhile, former players and commentators weighed in from a broader perspective, emphasizing how difficult it is for any young team to maintain offensive rhythm when rotations are constantly disrupted and defensive matchups shift due to foul accumulation. The conversation around Caitlin Clark specifically remained layered. Some analysts focused on her offensive production, pointing out that even in a difficult game environment, she still generated efficient scoring and playmaking numbers under pressure. Others focused on how her presence changes defensive attention and how Indiana's spacing tends to collapse without her initiating sets. Both perspectives existed simultaneously, and both were supported by stretches of what happened during the game. That duality is part of why Indiana's performances generate such intense discussion. The same game can produce completely different interpretations depending on which stretches someone focuses on. Inside broader WNBA media coverage, the game became a talking point not just for basketball reasons, but for visibility reasons as well. Any game involving high-profile players now carries a second layer of attention. How it performs in social media engagement, how clips circulate, and how quickly narratives form around key sequences. And this game generated plenty of clips. Not because of one defining moment, but because of accumulation. Foul sequences, momentum swings, bench stretches, transition runs, defensive breakdowns. All of them became isolated talking points online. And once clips detach from full game context, interpretation becomes fragmented. That fragmentation is what drives most of the post-game debate. Because different audiences are watching different versions of the same game. Broadcasters and analysts typically return to structure, shot quality, spacing efficiency, turnover creation, and defensive rotations. Fans tend to focus on individual moments, a foul call, a reaction, a possession sequence that felt pivotal. And social media amplifies the most emotionally charged interpretations from both sides. Meanwhile, Indiana's coaching performance also entered the discussion. Some analysts pointed to substitution patterns and offensive adjustments as areas where rhythm could have been stabilized earlier, especially during stretches where Atlanta built momentum through transition scoring and interior pressure. Others emphasized roster construction realities, highlighting that Indiana is still building chemistry with a relatively young core and learning how to maintain consistency across different game states. Both interpretations exist within normal basketball evaluation frameworks. But the intensity of attention around this particular game amplified every critique. Even positive performances were framed through contrast. Clark's scoring efficiency, Boston's interior dominance, and Mitchell's perimeter production were all acknowledged, but repeatedly compared against the team's inability to sustain defensive stops and control transition sequences. That contrast shaped most of the post-game narrative. On the opposing side, Atlanta's performance was generally framed as disciplined and physically committed, particularly in how they attacked the paint and capitalized on defensive rotations. Their ability to maintain pressure without relying on a single scoring burst became a key analytical point in post-game coverage. But even that praise existed inside a larger conversation about how the game flowed and why momentum shifted in the way it did. Because at the center of everything, the takeaway wasn't about one team dominating the other. It was about how fragile momentum becomes when structure breaks down under pressure, and how quickly a game can change when possession control, foul distribution, and defensive spacing stop aligning at the same time. By the end of the media cycle, The game had transformed from a single result into a case study. A case study in rhythm, in rotation management, in how quickly narratives form when high-profile players are involved, and in how every possession now carries meaning far beyond the scoreboard. By the time the game entered its final stretch, the outcome already felt familiar to anyone who had been watching closely. Not because of the scoreboard alone, but because of the pattern. Every time Indiana tried to stabilize momentum, Atlanta responded with either transition pressure or paint scoring that forced the defense to reset under stress. Every time Indiana found rhythm in the half-court, it came through structured initiation and spacing that looked noticeably cleaner when Caitlin Clark was handling the first action. And every time that structure broke, even briefly, the possession quality dropped immediately. That's what the fourth quarter distilled everything down to. Not a new storyline, just the clearest version of the existing one. Indiana attempted to tighten execution late, leaning into their primary creators to generate quick scoring responses. Boston continued to work inside, drawing contact and finishing through traffic. Mitchell kept attacking from mid-range pockets where she had been effective all game. And Clark continued to be the trigger point for the offense whenever she was allowed to initiate early in possessions. But Atlanta's defense didn't change their identity late. They didn't over-adjust. They simply continued doing what had worked: pressure the ball early, collapse into driving lanes, and force Indiana to finish possessions under defensive attention rather than clean reads. That's where the final separation in the game truly came from. Not a single run, but the inability for Indiana to sustain multiple clean possessions in a row when the game slowed down and every defensive stop mattered more. Then came the final twist in how the game would be interpreted afterward. Because while the scoreboard was settling, the conversation around the game was still escalating online. Clips from earlier sequences, fouls, defensive contact, bench reactions, and fast break breakdowns continued circulating in parallel with the live broadcast ending. Fans weren't just reacting to the final result anymore. They were reconstructing the game through isolated moments. And depending on which clip someone saw first, the entire game looked different. Some saw a physical, hard-fought contest decided by execution and depth. Others saw a game defined by disrupted rhythm and inconsistent control of momentum. And both interpretations were built from real possessions, but incomplete context. That gap between full game flow and clipped narrative became the real post-game story. Inside the arena, the final minutes felt like controlled closing execution from Atlanta, who managed possessions carefully and avoided unnecessary risks. Indiana, meanwhile, continued to push for quick responses but couldn't consistently generate stops on the other end to fully close the gap. And that's what sealed it. Not one play, but the accumulation of possessions where Indiana couldn't get consecutive defensive stops when they needed them most. After the final buzzer, players from both teams moved through standard post-game routines, handshakes, brief conversations, and the usual emotional reset that follows a physically demanding game. But outside the court, the narrative machine was already fully active. Broadcast discussions shifted immediately toward interpretation. What worked, what didn't, and how Indiana's offensive identity continues to fluctuate depending on ball handling initiation and defensive pressure. Analysts highlighted a central theme that had now shown up across multiple games. Indiana's offensive ceiling rises significantly when early possession structure is stable, but their margin for error shrinks dramatically when that structure is disrupted by foul trouble, defensive pressure, or rotation instability. That became the analytical lens most commentators returned to again and again. Not blame. Not personality. Structure. Meanwhile, social media continued pushing the conversation in more fragmented directions. Certain sequences were replayed with zoomed angles and slowed footage. Others were debated through statistical context. And some were interpreted purely through emotional reactions to specific moments in the game flow. That divergence is what makes modern sports discourse so volatile and so persistent. Because the game doesn't end when the clock hits zero anymore. It continues in clips, in threads, in replays, in arguments about what a possession really meant. And that's where the cliffhanger emerges, not from the game itself, but from what comes next. Because this wasn't just another regular season result added to the standings. It became a reference point. 4 officiating debates. 4 offensive structure discussions. 4 lineup dependency analysis. and for how quickly a single game can turn into multiple competing narratives depending on which part of it people focus on. Indiana now moves forward with questions that won't disappear overnight. How do they maintain offensive flow when primary initiation is disrupted? How do they stabilize defensive rotations when foul pressure affects personnel timing? And how do they convert high-level individual performances into consistent team control over full 40-minute stretches? Atlanta, meanwhile, leaves with validation of their approach, but also with attention that guarantees every future matchup will be analyzed under a sharper lens. And as the league moves on to the next slate of games, one thing is already clear. This matchup didn't just end. It echoed. And the next time these teams meet, nobody will be watching it the same way again. What you just saw wasn't just another night on the schedule. It was a full snapshot of how quickly momentum, structure, and execution can define a game at the highest level. One stretch of control can flip everything. One adjustment can shift the entire rhythm. And one possession at a time, the story writes itself before the final buzzer even arrives. That's what makes matchups like this so compelling to watch, and so heavily debated after they end. Every angle gets replayed. Every run gets dissected. Every decision gets questioned from a different perspective depending on what part of the game you focused on. And the conversation doesn't stay on the court anymore. It spreads across social media, post-game shows, analyst breakdowns, and fan discussions that continue long after the arena lights go down. That's the modern game, where performance and perception move side by side. So now the question shifts away from what already happened, and moves toward what comes next. Can Indiana turn strong individual performances into full game control when the pressure builds? Can Atlanta maintain that same level of physical consistency and execution across another high-intensity matchup? And how will the next meeting between these teams look once both sides have had time to adjust to everything this game revealed? Because games like this don't just disappear after the final score is posted. They become reference points. Moments teams go back to. Film sessions built around. And debates that don't end when the broadcast does. If you watched this far, you already know this wasn't a simple box score story. It was a game defined by rhythm, response, and resilience on both sides. Now the conversation continues. Drop your thoughts below. What do you think was the real turning point in this matchup? And if you want more breakdowns like this, covering every angle, every key possession, and every shift in momentum, make sure you stay locked in for the next one. Because in this league, the next story is never far away.